In ancient astrology, eclipses were viewed as omens of the death or downfall of prominent people. And in this video, I want to go over some examples, both current ones that are in the news that demonstrate that that is still true to this day, as well as some other recent examples from recent history that show the downfall or the death of prominent people during eclipse season. All right, so I'm recording this on February 19th, 2026, and the big news today is that Prince Andrew was just arrested in connection with some of the emails that came out over the past month in connection with the Jeffrey Epstein case and the Jeffrey Epstein files. And this was major notable news from an astrological standpoint because an eclipse just took place in Aquarius, a solar eclipse, only 2 days ago on February 17th. And in the news, this marked an important turning point because this is the first time somebody connected with the British royal family had been arrested in modern times. And there were no recent examples of this anytime in like the past century. So this is a major case and a major instance of a public downfall of like a notable or a prominent figure who's, in a very high position, but suddenly is suffering a public disgrace or a public downfall of some sort. And symbolically, part of the reason this comes up during eclipse season is because the sun and the moon are the two luminaries in astrology that represent the principle of light, but also prominence, sovereignty, and eminent or prominent individuals, basically. Like in ancient astrology, the sun represented the king and the moon represented the queen. So in ancient astrology, astrologers associated the sun and the moon with the king and the queen. And sometimes when one of the two luminaries was eclipsed, it was viewed as a negative omen, indicating that something negative would happen to the king or to the queen. And at first, you might think that this is just superstition or that it's something that they're just purely deriving for symbolic reasons. Except the problem is that this actually happens with surprising regularity, that you'll see prominent people suffering some sort of downfall, or in some instances, seeing the death of prominent people during eclipse season. And I'm going to share a bunch of examples with you during the course of this video to sort of demonstrate that this case with Prince Andrew and his public downfall here is not an isolated incident. Um, so that's one thing I want to focus on today. The other thing I want to focus on, and I want to try to distinguish a little bit, is in ancient astrology, there were also discussions about the death of prominent people, and we do see that as a theme where sometimes during eclipse season, there'll be really famous individuals or news headlines about famous individuals passing away. So one that just happened a couple of days ago on February 17th was Jesse Jackson. Passed away, I think, the night of the eclipse. It was certainly the day of the eclipse, pretty close to when it went exact in Aquarius based on the reports. And this was really notable because Jesse Jackson was the first African American that ran for president that garnered a lot of votes, like a large percentage of the votes during the 1984 and 1988 presidential elections. And that second one was most impressive astrologically because, of course, we also know that Saturn and Neptune were conjoining during that time in the sky. That was the last time there was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction when he, let's say, became the closest that he would ever get to becoming president, or that he was the first Black American to become the closest to becoming president prior to Obama. And then, of course, there was that famous like picture of Jesse Jackson in the crowd the night Obama won in Chicago, and Jesse Jackson was like crying at that time that I remember from the time that was really striking. So it's interesting on the one hand that there's a Saturn Neptune conjunction there in terms of him hitting potentially the height of his political career in 1988 during that presidential election under a Saturn Neptune conjunction, and then him passing away under a subsequent Saturn Neptune conjunction, which is part of the backdrop. But of course, the most obvious and prominent thing is that he died the day of a solar eclipse. So it's a really good example of we have two really prominent contemporary examples here. One of a prominent person dying the day of an eclipse, and another of a prominent person suffering a downfall. So to me, this confirms some of the traditional significations that ancient astrologers associated with eclipses, and it demonstrates that these were not just omens or not just things that were being interpreted purely symbolically, but there was actually empirical reasoning behind this, where ancient astrologers actually saw these things happening in their time and then recorded them based on their observations. And in the Eclipses in History episode I did with Nick Dig and Best a few years ago, we noted how there's one scholar of Mesopotamian studies who actually argued that part of the genesis of the astrological tradition in Mesopotamia is that there may have been a sequence of three kings who died in quick succession around the time of eclipses, and this may have caused them to start taking notice and to writing down when this happened in the future, which sounds a little bit, far-fetched or surprising, but in fact, the same thing happened in recent times in the 20th century, where the three British kings who died in the 20th century all died pretty close to eclipse season or pretty near to a solar or a lunar eclipse. And I'll mention some examples of that later. So, all right, so that's the premise. And then just to finish things off with Prince Andrew, he has Leo rising. This eclipse was in Aquarius in his seventh house. His birthday was literally today. So he was arrested the day of his birthday and his solar return. So it's sort of like marking this on his solar return chart for the entire year. And also, he just moved into a seventh house perfection year, which activates the sign of Aquarius. So there's all sorts of interesting things there in terms of the timing and the astrology that's sort of beside the point. I've also noted on recent episodes how he has a close Venus-Mars conjunction in his chart, just like the Venus-Mars conjunction in Jeffrey Epstein's chart, as well as in the chart of Ghislaine Maxwell. So it was something the three of them shared in common and part of the connection astrologically between the three of them. So we'll see how that case evolves from this point and where it goes from here. But in the rest of the video, I want to talk about some other instances of like public downfalls that have occurred under eclipses. So one other contemporary one, actually, I should mention is just today, there's a headline on February 19th that a South Korean court sentenced the former president to life in prison for an insurrection related to his failed attempt to impose martial law in December of 2024. And I remember that because there was a Mars retrograde that was happening during that time that coincided with that failed attempt to impose martial law. So they found him guilty of serious constitutional violations and sentenced him to life in prison. So that's another instance in a completely different country, in a completely different context of the downfall of a prominent individual happening during eclipse season within days of a solar eclipse. And I should define eclipse season because this is something that's become really important, that arose out of the eclipse research that I did with my friend Nick Dig and Best in our eclipses that coincided with pivotal events in history episode a few years ago. And let me show the diagram for the current eclipse season for those watching the video version, because I think that'll clarify things the most. All right, so here is the diagram for the current eclipse season where we see eclipses always come in pairs, and there's a solar eclipse in Aquarius on February 17th, and then 2 weeks later, there's always another eclipse, and then in this case, it's a lunar eclipse occurring on March 3rd in Virgo. So based on my research, eclipse season is something astrologers talk about, but it's not very well defined. But part of the definition that arose in the research that Nick Dick and Best and I did is that eclipse season really seemed to start getting really intense around the time that the moon reached the square before the first eclipse, the square with the sun before the first eclipse, which is usually about a week or so before the first eclipse takes place. And at that point, eclipse season really begins to ramp up. And then the first eclipse happens, and then there's a 2 week period where things are really intense right in the middle of eclipse season until the second eclipse takes place. And then eclipse season continues until about the time that the moon reaches the next square following the second eclipse, which is usually about a week, like 7 or 8 days after the second eclipse. So this ends up defining eclipse season as essentially about a month-long period that starts around a week before the first eclipse and ends about a week after the second eclipse. So that's the definition approximately of eclipse season that I'll be using in this video, just based on my research. All right, so let's get into some examples. So, since we're talking about the UK and Prince Andrew, another recent example of like a public downfall in the UK occurred just a few years ago when there was a solar eclipse on October 25th of 2022. And just 5 days before that eclipse was when Liz Truss resigned as the UK Prime Minister after just 45 days in office. So it was like a very short time as prime minister, and this was following a bunch of market turmoil that she announced her resignation and sort of had a public downfall as a prominent political figure. In the US, there was a similar one a couple years after that, which was on September 25th, 2024, is when Mayor of New York City Eric Adams was indicted. And this was right next to a solar eclipse that occurred on October 2nd, 2024, so that the event occurred just 7 days before the October eclipse. So again, that's one of those examples of things falling within this window of what I call eclipse season. And that was really the game changer for me after Nick and I did the historical research on eclipses in history that aligned with important events in history, was realizing that like an eclipse is not just a singular date, but instead it's often opening this window 7 days before the eclipse and 7 days after the eclipse. And then when you widen that window to basically looking at the two eclipses, they're always 2 weeks apart, that it widens it into about a month-long period when eclipses start taking place. And one of the things you often see during those periods is like prominent figures or sometimes political figures suffering some sort of downfall. All right. So Eric Adams was important just because that was the first time a sitting New York mayor was federally indicted, which just plunged his administration into chaos at the time. Another one that was really important that's more relevant to us currently is Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on July 6, 2019, and this was just 4 days after a total solar eclipse that occurred on July 2nd, 2019. So he was arrested at the airport on federal sex trafficking charges, and then he would end up dying in prison under mysterious circumstances only a month later. So, we're talking about eclipses here and the downfall of prominent individuals, and this was a really notable instance of that we're still feeling echoes of today because some of the subsequent eclipse seasons after his death have continued to reverberate in weird ways, almost as like recurrence transits. So, for example, this eclipse that just happened is now connected with Epstein, and then we see like Prince Andrew getting arrested basically 2 days after an eclipse, just like Epstein himself died 4 days after an eclipse. So, pretty interesting and weird echoes when it comes to that. Other recent ones that we've noted, because every eclipse season like this happens, and we often in the news section start recounting some of the public figures where there was like downfalls during our news recap each month. And one I remember back from 2022 was Kanye West, where he did this like major public outburst where he was just like saying all of this crazy stuff. And then on October 25th, 2022, Adidas officially terminated its massive Yeezy partnership following some of his public comments, which almost overnight wiped out his billionaire status. And this was taking place on October 25th, and this was literally the day of a partial solar eclipse on October 25th, 2022, at 2 degrees of Scorpio. So that was a really notable one at the time because we were like watching the fact that he was having this really public downfall at the time right on an eclipse. And of course, there's some discussion that could be had there, and it's a discussion we'll have a little bit more later about while sometimes eclipses can represent the finality of a major ending of something, which, like a death, for example, is the ultimate finality of everybody's physical life. Sometimes the public downfall doesn't mean the person has a downfall and you never hear from them again because sometimes people can make a comeback or come back up for different reasons. And obviously he's continued, Kanye in particular has continued to be relevant in different ways, but he's never quite like recovered, I feel like, from that eclipse season and some of the things that he said and he did back during that time. So that was one public example. Another one from the same eclipse season was on November 11th, 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried resigned from his company FTX, and the entire company collapsed basically during that eclipse season in one of the biggest crypto crashes that happened in history, as well as one of the biggest Ponzi schemes that happened in history that ended up being connected with him. So there was a lunar eclipse that took place on November 8th, 2022, and he ended up resigning as CEO right as his cryptocurrency exchange was filing for bankruptcy, basically 3 days after the eclipse. And this was a huge public downfall at the time because of the financial impact that it had on crypto and a number of other different things. Interestingly, connected with him, that was not the only eclipse season that was relevant. So that happened in November of 2022. But then 1 year later, during an eclipse season the following year, there was a partial lunar eclipse on October 28th, and just within 5 days of that, 5 days later, on November 2nd, 2023, he was found guilty on all 7 counts of fraud, uh, cementing basically his total collapse as a public figure, and ended up being convicted and sentenced to prison for a very, very long time. So that was another good example of a public downfall because sometimes, in some instances, like with him, a public downfall is not always like a singular event. Sometimes there's a really pivotal moment that occurs when things pivot suddenly downwards for that person near an eclipse season. But oftentimes, eclipses can also represent a series of events that unfold over a period of time, and you'll see connections between these 6 month increments of like one part of the downfall happens on one eclipse, and then 6 months later, another thing will happen, and then 6 months later, another piece of the story will fall into place. So that was the case with him with these two successive eclipses, or these two eclipses separated by 12 months, really being crucial in terms of his downfall. All right. Another recent example that was really prominent was on March 25th, 2022, Sean Diddy Combs' home was raided. And this was literally the day of an eclipse, which took place on March 25th, 2024, in the sign of Libra. So, what ended up happening is that Homeland Security raided his Los Angeles and Miami mansions, and this effectively marked the sudden collapse of his empire and his reputation, like really quickly, like virtually overnight. And there was all of these pictures at the time in the tabloids of things being taken out of his house and all this weird stuff. And eventually he would be convicted and sent to jail. But this eclipse like marked this pivotal turning point where it all started to fall apart for him, essentially. Um, let's see, similar ones. I got a lot of these. They're not all pretty, but let's do it. So R. Kelly was arrested on federal sex crimes on July 11th, 2019, and this was 5 days before an eclipse took place. There was a partial lunar eclipse on July 16th, 2019 in Capricorn. So this was again another example of like a public downfall of a prominent musician. He was arrested by federal agents in Chicago, and this permanently ended his freedom and any remaining public standing basically from that point forward. So it's tricky because on one hand, sometimes we're seeing physically, this being the turning point where somebody who's really rich and powerful and influential and has a lot of like self-autonomy suddenly finds themselves having a downfall and ending up on the opposite side of things and like losing everything or losing their freedom or other things like that. But there's also an element to the eclipses sometimes that have to do with a person's public reputation and public recognition. That's also an important element as well, where sometimes prominent people are having their reputation, which used to be really good up to that point, in some instances just completely fall off a cliff. And the reverse of that, or the flip side of that coin, that I'm not going to focus on in this video, but is worth mentioning in passing, is eclipses act as like these pivot points. And while I'm focusing on the one side of the scenario, which is like the public figure that has a downfall, the other thing that happens during eclipse season is you'll see previously obscure people who were not prominent suddenly rise into prominence in the public consciousness. So all of a sudden, like new celebrities are made, or you have people doing important things that suddenly comes into the public consciousness at that time, so that their reputation and their legacy becomes cemented in connection with some specific event or some specific action that they've taken. So that's important to mention as well. Another one, like going way back to 2004, like a lot of these are like, men doing not good things, but like more of a pop culture one was way back in October of 2004. And this was 5 days before an eclipse took place in Taurus on October 28th. Ashlee Simpson, the singer, went on Saturday Night Live, and there was this lip syncing disaster where she was supposed to give this important public performance, and then she gets up there and starts singing, but then they played the wrong track basically, and there was a technical snafu, and she was caught lip syncing, which basically resulted in an immediate massive public humiliation, and it seriously damaged her singing career. So oftentimes people look back on that as the point at which her career really went south as a singer, and that she wasn't quite able to recover after that point. So that's another example of, sometimes like a mishap or a disaster or something in the person's life that causes severe harm to their reputation, but also that changes the trajectory of the person's life direction from that point forward. There's been a bunch of instances because I write some of these down and I collect some of these things, and I'm pulling on some of my lists. But there were a bunch of instances of like news and media personalities suffering public downfalls over the past decade that showed up during eclipse seasons as well. So to give some quick examples, on December 4th, 2021, Chris Cuomo was fired by CNN. He was a prominent CNN anchor up to that point, and this was literally the day of a total solar eclipse, which occurred on December 4th, 2021. And he was fired during the course of an investigation into his involvement with his brother's political scandal, because his brother was also going through a sort of scandal at that time, and he was a prominent politician. So, prominent news anchor gets fired by CNN. Interestingly, there was another example of that just a couple years later, where on April 24th, 2023, Don Lemon was fired by CNN. And this was just 4 days after an eclipse, which took place on April 20th, 2023 at 29 degrees of Aries. So he was fired abruptly and was ousted in this really striking way because he wasn't the only person fired that day. But it turns out on another news network, on Fox News, Tucker Carlson was fired on the exact same day, on April 24th, 2023, again, just 4 days after a solar eclipse occurred on April 20th, 23. And the two of them getting ousted on the same day was a really striking thing. And, one of the things that is important here is that like both of those people obviously are still in the public consciousness. Actually, I should say all three of them, because all three of them have gone on to do other media things and continue to be prominent in different ways, but just not in that position where they were suddenly fired from the news network that they had been working with. And then some of them have gone on to start their own podcasts or do their own independent like news reporting since then and continue to be like prominent figures in the news. But at the time, it was a really major setback and sort of public downfall for people that had become known through those specific news networks that they were anchors for or reporters on. To give another example, though, of it being like a temporary setback or sometimes a temporary downfall, there was James Gunn was fired by Disney on July 20th, 2018. And this was just 7 days before an eclipse, which took place on July 27th, 2018 in Aquarius. And he was fired from a major movie, from directing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And this was after some old tweets resurfaced where he had said some like bad things on some old tweets. And then all of a sudden he kind of got canceled and Disney fired him from this major project. But what was interesting about that is like it was really bad, but then at some point, things kind of calmed down or things kind of cooled down, and then Disney ended up bringing him back, and now he's still like a prominent figure in terms of directing major superhero movies and things like that. So again, sometimes these are like public downfalls, but sometimes in the long scope of things, it can be like a temporary setback or the closing of one chapter, important chapter in the person's life, but at the opening of a new one. And I guess, for all of us thinking about eclipses personally, that's probably the most important takeaway is while sometimes it can be the finality of a really major ending in some part of our life, especially based on the house placement of where the eclipse falls in your birth chart, sometimes it can be the closing of one chapter, but also the opening of another, because an eclipse, remember, is a conjunction, and a conjunction between two planets is always the closing of one cycle between those two planets, but it's also the opening of another cycle and the laying of the seeds or the foundations for something else that will grow and develop from that point forward. So one last example of that, again, of a temporary, but what seemed at the time like a major setback was on December 18th, 2019, the U.S. House of Representatives formally voted to adopt two articles of impeachment against Donald Trump, and this was his first impeachment. So this took place just 8 days before an eclipse happened, a solar eclipse happened on December 26th, 2019. So again, major setback at the time. And of course, Trump would go through all sorts of things over the course of the next year and lose the presidency to Biden. But then, of course, over the past decade, we've seen a major resurgence and comeback, eventually culminating in him being reelected as president a second time, which is, again, a similar theme with several of the ones we've just gone over, which is that sometimes it's a major setback or the end of one chapter and even a public downfall of some sort, but it also lays the seeds of and the seeds or the foundations for something new. All right, so those are all the like public downfall ones. I did want to mention just briefly because in the ancient texts, deaths are also mentioned really prominently when it comes to eclipses. And I wanted to focus this episode primarily on downfalls, but I will mention a few deaths just to sort of make things complete, since that's going to be the other thing that we already saw in the case of like Jesse Jackson, and there will probably be some other prominent ones coming up in the near future. So some of the prominent ones are I mentioned the three kings in the UK that died in the 20th century, and this is we found this doing the first Eclipses in History episode with Nick, but here are the three ones. So King Edward the Seventh dies on May 6th, 1910, and this is just 3 days close to an eclipse which took place, a total solar eclipse which happened on May 9th, 1910 in the sign of Taurus. So he died, the eclipse happened just 3 days after his death. Or King George V died on January 20th, 1936, and this was near a lunar eclipse that happened on January 8th, 1936. So this is the only one in my list that's a little wide. It's 12 days after the eclipse, but still pretty close and prior to the next lunation that would take place after the eclipse happened. So then the king after him, King George VI, died on February 6, 1952, and this was 5 days before an eclipse took place on February 11th, 1952 in Leo. So these are like the three kings that died in the 20th century in the UK, and they all died back to back near eclipses, basically within a week or 2 weeks of eclipses in the case of King George I or King George V. So that's extraordinary. It's always been one of my most impressive findings when it comes to deaths, when it comes to the royal family. But as we talked about in that episode, actually, the British royal family eclipses are just like constantly happening during important events during the course of the British royal family. The one today with Prince Andrew is an example of that. Those other deaths of the different kings are examples, but there's a ton of other examples. For example, one of the more prominent ones was Princess Diana died on August 31st, 1997, and this is just one day before an eclipse, which took place on September 1st, 1997. So again, another example of a prominent death of a prominent figure, in this instance in the royal family. But it's not just royalty, it also applies to presidents as well. So, for example, one of the most prominent ones was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln occurred just 3 days after an eclipse, where Lincoln died on April 14th, 1865, when he was famously shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater. And then an eclipse happened on April 11th, 1865. So the eclipse literally acted as an omen, and then 3 days after it, he was tragically assassinated. Or more recently, in 1978, the death of Pope John Paul I happened just 4 days before an eclipse, where Pope John Paul died on September 28th, 1978. And he died just suddenly after just 33 days of being the Pope, which sort of threw the Vatican into unexpected upheaval, which is another element of eclipse season, which is this feeling of upheaval and of chaotic energy where there's a ton of different stuff happening all in a relatively short span of time that are often like major things happening, but it can feel like you're sailing into a storm and trying to get through it on a boat. So he died on right next to that partial solar eclipse that happened on October 2nd, 1978, just 4 days before the eclipse. Another prominent one in the US was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., who died on April 4th, 1968. And this was 7 days after an eclipse took place on March 28th, 1968. So, major theme with assassinations, and this also has happened in other countries. So, for example, the assassination of Indira Gandhi happened October 31st, 1984, when she was assassinated by her bodyguards. And this was 8 days before an eclipse took place on November 8th, 1984. So, this led to an immediate change in India's leadership and was a really major event that took place at that time. And then one last example, just a sort of nod to the medieval tradition that I've been researching recently in terms of the history of attitudes and writings about eclipses in the ancient world and how eclipses were regarded during different time frames. So there's an eclipse that's sometimes referred to as King Henry's eclipse, referring to King Henry the First of England. And what happened is there was a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse that occurred on August 2nd in the year 1133, so during the Middle Ages or during the medieval period. And what happened is that on the exact day of this eclipse, King Henry the First departed England for Normandy, but he would never return alive because he would end up dying. And there was a contemporary historian at the time named William Malmesbury who famously linked the quote unquote hideous darkness of this eclipse to the king's departure and his eventual death, cementing the idea that in medieval lore, where the ultimate like textbook example of a negative indication of an eclipse for a ruler was this departure chart for him. So sometimes it's not always like the day that a person will die, but sometimes it's like taking the action or the step that will lead to something important and lead to an important ending or the end of a chapter, or in the worst case scenario, in that instance, the end of his life. So, those are all my examples today for this little video I wanted to do today, just reflecting on the downfall of prominent people during eclipse seasons. And I think we can see now why ancient people developed this notion where they started associating eclipses with the death or the downfall of prominent individuals. And if you go back and study the history of Mesopotamian astrology, which is functionally like the origins of Western astrology, it starts about 4,000 years ago when they start writing down on these little clay tablets omens of like things that would happen in the sky and then things that would happen on Earth. And some of the scholars, I believe Francesca Rochberg, for example, writes that eclipse omens are some of the earliest recorded astrological omens that the Mesopotamians wrote down and started trying to pass down to future generations. And I think, we can really see why at this point because of the consistent pattern that happens with eclipses of notable individuals suffering these downfalls. So, as I pointed out, a downfall is not always permanent. And in some instances, with a lot of prominent people, we've seen them make comebacks after suffering a public downfall or defeat. This is also true in terms of people's personal lives, that sometimes an eclipse is the end of a major chapter in your life, but that also marks a new beginning. So pay attention to that and often pay attention to little beginnings, because one of the things I've noticed during eclipse season consistently is that it'll plant the seeds or the foundations for something new in your life. But oftentimes, if you're not paying attention to it, you'll overlook how important that thing was that you just started doing at that time. And oftentimes, it's only in retrospect that you'll look back and realize that a major beginning happened at that period that was much more momentous than you thought. But if you're an astrologer and you're conscious of being in eclipse season and conscious of the potential for a major new beginning at this time, then sometimes you can spot it as it's happening and realize even if that thing that you just started doing that's a new thing doesn't practically, from a practical standpoint, seem that significant at first, sometimes as an astrologer, you'll know that this thing is actually much more important than it might seem. All right. So when it comes to our current eclipse season, like I said, our current eclipse season is not over yet. We are still, what are we? We're only like a quarter of the way into it. So here's the graphic again for eclipse season showing where we're at. We are literally just 2 days after the first eclipse, the solar eclipse. So we've got another week while this first eclipse is still really powerful in Aquarius. And then at that point, around the 24th, the Virgo eclipse starts ramping up. And then we get that second peak. And then basically a week after that, after March 3rd, when the second eclipse takes place, is when the eclipse window will roughly wrap up sometime around the 11th. So I'm expecting some other major things to happen during the course of that time. There's going to be of course, other instances of prominent downfalls or potentially the deaths of prominent figures in the world. There's one major one in particular that I'm anticipating that we discussed on the last forecast. So I'll be paying attention to the news to see what happens in the coming weeks. And if you notice any other major examples of that, please let me know in the YouTube comments, since I don't always see all the headlines, and sometimes it's good if we can pool our resources by writing these things down as astrologers and collectively reflecting on them and then passing that information on to future generations, which is basically what astrologers have been doing with eclipses for over 4,000 years now. All right, so I think that's it. Let me know in the YouTube comments if you'd like to see me do other follow-up videos on eclipses. I kind of focused more on downfalls in this instance. I could probably do another follow-up one, honestly, on like prominent deaths that have occurred in history under eclipses because there's a lot of them. I could also probably do a more like happier, optimistic video of like previously obscure figures becoming prominent or having important turning points. So let me know by posting a YouTube comment if you'd like me to see me do other videos like that in the future, or if you have a good eclipse story of your own that's happening right now during the current eclipse season or past ones, let me know as well. All right, I think that's it for this episode. So thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and I'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you want to get access to bonus content, then become a patron through my page on Patreon, where you can get early access to new episodes, attend live recordings and webinars, access the monthly electional astrology podcast, the secret astrology podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. Find out more at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Isa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. If you're looking for good dates to do things this year, then be sure to check out our 2026 Electional Astrology Report, which is a guide to the most fortunate dates in 2026. You can get it at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. If you're really looking to take your studies of astrology to the next level, then consider signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus live webinars and Q&A sessions each month, and at the end of the course, you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, then check out the new consultations page on the podcast website, where I have a list of astrologers I recommend for birth chart readings and other types of consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on it by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program called AstroGold for Mac OS, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount at their website, which is astrogold.io. And shout out to our sponsors for this episode, including the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening in Seattle and being live streamed online May 21st through the 25th, 2026. Find out more information at norwac.net, as well as the United Astrology Conference, which is happening in Chicago this year, September 3rd through the 9th, 2026. Find out more information about that at uacastrology.com.